Hello, I'm Jeremy Fuster with The Wrap. For this week's Writers' Strike Roundtable, we're joined by four writer-producers for whom this is not their first strike, as they marched on the picket lines with the WGA back in the winter of 2007. Joining us today are Stacy Rukeyser, creator of Sex Life and writer-producer on One Tree Hill, William Lucas Walker, writer-producer on Frasier and Roseanne, and creator of the upcoming Dads of DeWitt, Javier Grillo-Marxuach, writer-producer on The Witcher and The Dark Crystal Age of Resistance, and Marta Kauffman, co-creator and writer-producer of Friends and Grace and Frankie. All of you, thank you for joining us here at The Wrap.
Thanks for having us.
Great.
So let's start with, just take us back to 2007. I just want to hear from each of you, where were you in your careers back then, and what are your most profound memories from that strike? Stacy, we'll start with you.
So I was writing on a show called October Road, which was a really fun show to write and produce. And I was really bummed that we weren't going to continue to get to do that. I think I had just finished producing my episode when the strike started, and we were sort of trying to have wrap parties and stuff with our friends from the crew while we were walking the picket line during the day. And it was, it was a different time. I mean, I can talk about how I feel like it was different from this strike, but I do feel that the issues that were on the table were issues that people who had a lot more foresight than me were seeing in terms of what was coming. And that feels like the biggest difference from today, is that these are issues that I feel like we've already experienced and in some ways suffered from. So at that time, we were like, yeah, that sounds important for the future. But it wasn't like, we'd already been bloodletting in the way that we have now.
Well, let me start by saying I was also in the 1988 one, but we won't talk about that one. Well, my biggest memory of the 1988 one was there was a rally in Century City, and a gazillion people there. And there was an elderly man in a wheelchair who had been a writer on The Lucy Show. And someone said to him, "Curious why you're here. You're not writing, you're retired. Why are you here?" And he said, "I'm here for the younger writers." And that really, really had a lot of impact on me. And I feel like that is true now. We are here for the younger writers who aren't going to get an opportunity to learn how to become showrunners. So that's my biggest memory of 2007.
For me, 2007 was about a massive moral dilemma that I was looking at, because I was a week away from producing a pilot. I was in Vancouver. The entire crew was ready to go. And what I wound up doing was locking the blue pages for the pilot and wishing them good luck. I stayed around, but the Guild didn't have the same stringent policies then about producing, but it was still a real balancing act. And my ultimate sort of calculus was, it's a pilot, so it can't be broadcast. It's not going to benefit anybody unless the strike ends. So I felt like I could do that and not basically relieve a bunch of people of their jobs, but it was a really hard decision. I think the other one, the biggest difference for me between 2007, that's my personal biggest difference, but politically the biggest difference is that, how much profanity may I use in this broadcast, by the way?
Go ahead. We trust you. We trust you will use it judiciously.
I think that the biggest difference between 2007 and now is that everyone in the labor force is tired of being fucked over by billionaires. Everything in the United States, from writing to working fast food counters, has been subject to a very, very coordinated campaign to destroy the labor union movement in this country. And everything has also been subject to a massive campaign to turn everything into a gig economy. Social media is full of stories of people who are working 39 hours because 40 would make them full-time. They wouldn't have any benefits. It's happening across the board. So we are a guild that is very visible, and what we do is very visible. And I feel like when you just look at what happened on our rally, where the DGA, SAG, IATSE and the Teamsters were there. And, I think you're starting to see that this strike isn't just about the writers have a perception of the future that other people can't see and has to be explained because Netflix is still a DVD rental service. Everybody knows the cost this time, and we're getting that support.
Yeah, I was not in the 1988 strike, but I was sort of impacted by it. I had decided to try to move into television, and I was lucky enough to have Tom Fontana as a mentor. And they were just about to start a show filming in New York, where I lived at the time. And he had invited me on to be an observing director and to sort of learn a little bit about television. And suddenly he calls and says, "Oh, we're going to be on strike, so put it off." And it turned out being 5 months. So that was my first experience. 2007, I moved to Los Angeles in 1991, and I had a string of sitcoms I worked on. Now, when I moved here from New York, I had imagined that I would just fail in better weather because I hadn't been very lucky in New York. But things happened very quickly here, and I was writing for a long time. And my daughter was born in 2001, and I'm a gay man. And for a gay man to be able to have a child back then was very new. And I really didn't want to fuck it up. And I took a big step back from my career. And then my son was born in 2006. And then I put it all on hold. So by the time the 2007 strike came around, my daughter was 6 and she was on the line with me. And I was raising kids and changing diapers and doing all of that. But as Marta said, we're there for each other. That's the thing that I think a lot of people don't get. When I was working on Frasier, David Lloyd, who wrote the famous Chuckles the Clown episode, got to be friendly with him. And he mentioned that he doesn't get residuals from that. He doesn't get residuals from any of the Mary Tyler Moore shows or the great shows that he wrote on. And that was the result of a strike, an earlier strike. And I was sort of flabbergasted by that. 2007, in every strike, it seems like somebody is seeing the future, somebody smarter than me in the Writers Guild. First, it was VHS tapes and DVDs, which became huge after those strikes. And they tried to downplay those and say, "Oh, well, we're just figuring that out, or we don't know what that market is yet." And we sort of got screwed with VHS that way. And DVDs didn't really go up much in terms of residuals. In 2007, the big wave of the future was not even called streaming. It was the internet. There's this sort of nebulous internet that was huge. But because, again, they didn't know what it was going to become, it's like a whole different sector. It seems like the AMPTP for the first time, it's always been the networks and cable. And now it's sort of like the Republican Party pulling against itself. I think you have the legacy media, and then you have streaming, and their interests are very different. And I think they're far apart. And I wondered if in this strike, I'm wondering what the tension is like. I was talking to someone the other day who's on the negotiating committee, and she said, so far, they're holding very tightly together and cohesive. But I think if the strike drags out the way I imagine it's going to, the people who are much closer to what we want, like the networks and some of the legacy, it's a matter of increasing minimums and those kinds of things. But their residual setup is already there, and it's in place, and it has kept many of us going. But the streaming residual situation is terrible.
If I may add on to what both Javi and Bill were referring to, one of the differences I see between 2007 and this strike is people are pissed. And people are scared because they're trying to phase out writers. And in the 3 strikes I've been a part of, I've never seen solidarity and energy like this.
Yeah, agreed. and what Marta was saying earlier too about the younger generation, I I mentor a number of younger writers and directors now, and one of them is 35 and he's still a writer's assistant. And I've read he's got really good specs. And I was talking to another guy on the line the other day, and he got in 3 or 4 years ago on a Nickelodeon multicam with 22 episodes. And he thought, oh, wow, I'm in, I'm starting, this is great. And then he said over the last 3 years, all he's gotten is 8 to 10 week mini rooms that he was, cut from as soon as they went. And the last one was they were trying to rush things up right before the strike. And it was a 2-week mini room, and they offered him a script that said, would you take $2,000 for it? And that's, the house that I'm in now, I bought 3 years after I joined the Guild in 1995. And I've raised my family here. And young writers can't even begin to think of doing anything like that. It's just completely different ballgame. And all it's talking about is existential. It sounds dramatic, but it is dramatic. We are fighting for the future of this career.
Now, Marta, Will, you both touched on something that we've heard from a lot of people about how it's become this new status quo where it's harder than ever for younger writers to begin that upward climb up to the writer-producer positions that you all have. But I'm also curious, because for you guys, I'm wondering if there's also been this downward pressure on how you're compensated before, during, and after television is produced, because we've heard from the WGA that the downward decline of writer compensation has been affecting all levels of writer positions. Have you seen that from your own projects, especially on streaming?
The thing is, this is all a factor of this unbundling that they do now. Unbundling is everything from Netflix charges you extra for high def, right? When you're just watching it at home, right? Or you pay more to not see commercials, right? So the way that broadcast used to be structured is you would have your 20 to 13 with a back 9, 22 episode order, right? And you had an episodic fee, and that was your salary. And then you got paid for the scripts in addition to that, which gave you a very nice place from which to build a living, build a career, and survive if you didn't work a little bit after that, okay? Now, I'm an executive producer, but I get paid a weekly on scale because they have decided that my producerial services are unbundleable from my writing services, right? So a vast percentage of what I earned is no longer available to me, okay? Not to mention that, because they don't have deadlines in which to complete deals, they can basically sweat you out on a deal for months. So if you demand more money than they offer, they'll just make the deal drag until you capitulate, because they're in no rush, because there's no fall season to program, okay? So that's a big part of it. And the thing is, the other knock-on effect of unbundling those things, when the Writers Guild talks about writer salaries going down from anywhere from 20 to 40%, that's absolutely true for those of us who are working steadily. When you talk about people who are trying to start in the business or in the lower levels, they don't get to work on 22 episodes a year, okay? And that's a huge shortfall in their income, okay? Because the orders are now 6, 7, 8 episodes. So part of the problem with the income stream is that writing has become an endless hustle. You get one job, that in 22 weeks, you're going to be out of a job. So you have to start looking for the other job. All of those things are economic pressures on writers that have happened because the studios have figured out how to loophole a deal that was robust for broadcast and adapt it to how they produce television.
And I'll just say, I think it's really unfortunate that this is happening at a time when finally there is more diversity of voices in terms of the shows that are being created. I know for me, I was a TV writer for 20 years before I created my own show, and fought for a long time in there when I was the only woman in the writer's room trying to fight for stories that felt like truthful, organic female stories for me. And so now here I am finally with my own show, and I would do anything for it. I would do anything to make it as good as I wanted and knew that it could be. And that included, acquiescing to some of these new policies that the streamers have that do exert that downward pressure, even on showrunners that you're talking about. I've always prided myself on being a real mentor to younger writers, on having young writers go produce their episodes, even as staff writers, because that's how I was mentored and trained. And that is just not an option anymore, you know. And a lot of people say, well, it's up to the showrunner to fight for it. And I'm here to tell you, I have fought for it. And I have been successful to some degree, but not to get all of my writers on set producing their own episodes. And I know, you know, people talk about that Sean Ryan was able to do that on The Night Agent at Netflix. Well, God bless Sean Ryan. You know, I don't have the clout, apparently, of Sean Ryan to be able to do that. So I'm not able to do all the things for my younger writers that I want to do. And at the same time, you know, in terms of what Javi's talking about, it took us 61 weeks to do 6 episodes in the second season of Sex Life. So that episodic fee that a showrunner is usually given, it means nothing because, you know, they give you a weekly minimum that is across the board, the number that they give to all showrunners. It doesn't matter if you've run shows before, however many years of experience you have, whatever awards you might have won. If you're not on an overall deal, that is the number that you are paid. And there is an even lower number that is below WGA minimum, that is the number you are paid in post-production. So the 4 months of post-production are below WGA minimum and do not include any contributions to your health insurance. So you're working on this show, you are, you know, producing and editing your show, but you have to go write something else in order to just get health insurance coverage. And, you know, that's again, part of this unbundling, because they would say, oh, that's producing, that's not writing, which I just patently disagree with. But it is all that pressure to try to separate, find a loophole, find a way to you know, to do it in a more, even more freelance way than we've worked before.
Now, another thing that I want to talk to you guys about is AI, because I remember that William said earlier something about how, you know, in one strike, I believe it was 1988 strike, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 1988, they were reluctant to really put in terms on compensation for VHS residuals because they didn't know how the VHS market was going to work. In 2007, they didn't want to put in really strict compensation guidelines on streaming because they didn't know how that was going to work. And the rationalization was, you know, we don't know how streaming is going to work without ads, and now we know. And from what I have heard from members of the WGA negotiating committee is that they didn't want to have any further stricter guidelines on artificial intelligence, and it was the same rationalization. Like, we don't know how AI is going to work. We'll meet with you every year on all of this, but that's as far as they went in regards to AI. For you guys, like, I'm sure you heard that same thing from the negotiating committee. Is there's sort of a feeling of deja vu that it's another example of the studios not wanting to compensate because they hold up uncertainty about the future?
In each strike, there seems to be one of these future things that they go, oh, just let us figure it out. And we got really burned in 88. And that's why 2007 we held out. And AI is the same sort of thing.
I believe it was David Goodman talking to Carolyn Bardini, who is the president of the AMPTP. And her comment to him was, and I'm not quoting directly, but it's very, very close to this, that they won't talk about AI because they don't want to put themselves at a disadvantage regarding technology they plan on using. So I think this is bigger than we don't know. They have a plan. They want to get rid of writers. There's plenty else they want to do, but they have a plan. This is not, we don't know. Not really what's going on. And a studio head, I can't remember who they told, someone on the negotiating committee, that they're 2 years away.
It's terrifying, honestly. Like, I've been on ChatGPT. I've done things like, hey, I actually asked ChatGPT to spit out a treatment for an episode of a show I created. Okay. And it's not a show anybody knows. Like, literally, it was on ABC Family for 12 episodes. It was a show I was making in 2007. and it spat out something that had no creativity to it, but structurally made sense. And had a lot of like language that if I heard from a staff writer in a room, I'd be like, go figure that out. Things like in the course of the episode, this person figures that out about themselves, right? But for a nascent technology, that's terrifying, The other thing is, it's terrifying because it could replace us, but it's terrifying for another reason. There's a really great line in the movie Guardians of the Galaxy that's about AI, and the movie is, the line is, it can only think thoughts that have already been thought. Okay? And that is actually the bigger danger, is that, this piece of meat inside our heads may be unwieldy, but it can actually even recombine things in ways that are creative. That is where creativity comes from. And I think that AI basically is going to feed off of all of the creativity of humanity for the last 100 years that's digitized in the web. But what you're going to get is a stagnation of our ability to create new things. And that's as terrifying to me as being replaced by a machine, which I'm sure will happen.
And again, just in this moment where there is more of an explosion of a diversity of voices, if you take it regurgitating what's been in the last 100 years, I think it's going to put out stories that I was trying to fight against back in the early 2000s to say that doesn't feel truthful to me as a woman, and that is going to be the inherent bias in the mechanism.
And the other thing is that it is literally taking, look, tropes are tropes. I love tropes. Tropes are the building blocks of narrative. You combine them with story, with story and character. You've got drama. They're not something to be feared, but they can be improved. They can be built upon. They can, and if the computer is taking out tropes, taking out stuff from other people, at a certain point that does become plagiarism. And look, if they can create an AI that can compile the collected narrative of the entire world as digitized on the internet, surely they can come up with an algorithm that sources every single piece of knowledge that computer is using. It's actually a much easier thing than to create an artificial. In fact, they could have an artificial intelligence that does it. So if they have a plan and they're going to replace us, I'd love for them to have a residual structure for every time an AI uses an idea that I had for myself.
Well, it's
that would be awesome.
Plagiarism. If they're pulling on, I mean, I've just created a series, and of course, it's my story. It's based on my family and that sort of thing. But the specter for me is, okay, I create 2 seasons of the show, and they go bye Bill, and they create the next 8 seasons based on what's been fed into the first 2 seasons. I mean, that's something I can totally see them thinking, oh, let's keep this going, or taking hit shows from 10 years ago, instead of rebooting them with new scripts that they've come up with that have nothing to do with the creator or with the creative team. And that's terrifying. And the actors who are on the lines with us, I think, are fearing very much the same thing.
The thing I do believe, though, is that there's a big difference between AI and streaming or DVD, which is that only a studio can operate streaming. And I can't start a streaming company. I mean, I guess I could, but you're not going to want to watch it, It'll be running out of my home. It'll be a lot of stuff in my office, AI is available to anybody who can get a GDP chat client, and you can just GPT, GDP, whatever the hell it's called. I also encourage writers not to basically approach this technology ruthlessly and creatively, and begin to figure out what can we do with it that is productive for us. How can we make it work for us? Let's adopt the technology and be the ones who decide how it's going to be used, rather than just letting the studios figure out how to monetize it.
There's one other thing I want to throw in, and that is, the signs on the picket line are amazing, but some of them are super profound. And there were 2 of them I want to bring up. One of them was AI didn't have childhood trauma, which actually it is the sum of our experiences, even when we're not writing about ourselves, that inform what we're writing. The other one that was spectacular was, in quotes, it said, "I'll have what she's eating," end quote, written by AI.
Another part of this strike, because I've talked with some writers over the past few weeks about how they're getting ready for the long haul. So the first few weeks, there is that, okay, we're on strike, we're going to do this, There's that initial adrenaline, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. You guys know it was the last one was 100 days. And there's also the fact that I have heard from people that they expect the studios would have an incentive to drag it out for several months so that they can use the force majeure clauses to terminate any production deals that they feel aren't worth spending on anymore, especially with Wall Street telling them you have to cut costs. For you guys, I don't know if any of you have any production deals, but what are your thoughts on the possibility of this being dragged out until they can pull all of these production deals? Is that a concern to you?
They can go fuck themselves. That's where I am. Yes, that is not something that I wouldn't believe. Sorry about the double negative. I absolutely think that's part of what they're doing. Not all, but part.
Look, the Writers Guild is a guild that has a lot of free thinkers in it, okay? And also, I don't know if you've read a lot of the recent reporting about toxic upper management in television, but there's also a fair number of people who are pretty craven and greedy, okay? And in 2007, there was talk of there being secret meetings between showrunners trying to figure out how they could either divest themselves of the guild or influence the studios to end the strike early. There's always going to be people who care more about their paycheck than about the future, than about the young writers, and about any of that. I'm not afraid of the studios dragging this out. They will drag this out. You have to count on this. These are corporations. Corporations are not people. I love many of the executives I work with, but corporations are machines for profit, and they will basically wait us out because machines don't need patience, What I'm more worried about is that elements in the guild that have that level of greed, that lack of concern for their fellows, that lack of solidarity will begin to work within the guild to undermine us. And it's going to start when they start force majeuring deals, because somebody is inevitably going to go, oh, I lost my overall deal. What a tragedy. By the way, it's not. If you've got an overall deal, you'll get another one probably. That's how overall deals mostly work. But a lot of people just don't want to lose that. And that for me is the bigger fear. I don't fear the studios. I know what they're going to do. They're going to fight dirty and they're going to wait us out. Try to wait us out. It's the people whom I have known in the business to be abusers and to be greedy and craven and to be selfish that I'm more worried about.
Now, there's another part of the 2007 strike I wanted to ask you about, because there was an article that was written by the American Prospect a couple of weeks ago about how back in 2007, the AMPTP hired a consulting firm, Fabiani and Lehane, to run full-page ads in the trades and run all these other ads, like saying like, oh, the writers are losing this much money every day they continue the strike, trying to turn public opinion against the strike. This time around, I have heard that there is so much cross-union solidarity, and I believe it was Javi who mentioned that it's not just within Hollywood. There's so many people that feel like they're being screwed over by billionaires. There's much more of a pro-labor sentiment. Do you feel confident that if something similar to what they did with Fabiani and Lehane with these consulting firms was tried later this summer, that it's not going to work because there's so much more public momentum behind the WGA this time?
Well, one of the big differences this time, huge, is social media. We have been able to, I think that's why so much of the public is on our side. We've never been able to get our message out, even in a fraction of the way before that we're able to do this time. And people are, and that combined with touching this nerve that everyone is experiencing across America, their jobs being cut and, cashiers in grocery stores being replaced by scanning machines and all that sort of people, they get it. But the fact that we're able to spread what we're doing right now will spread the message, and people will hear these stories, the stories of the other roundtables you've done. And I mean, every day I Google WGA strike and there are tons of stories on it. It wasn't like this the last time.
The CEO compensation, everybody knows this figure, but in 2021, Zaslav, Iger, Chapek, Rupert Murdoch, and Reed Hastings and Ted Sarandos collectively made $773 million. Now, that money could literally give us everything we're asking for, okay? That money times 3 years, if they get that executive compensation for 3 years, or heck, if they don't get that much, but 5 years, would be enough to cover the Guild's entire health and pension fund. It's $2.1 billion, okay? Literally, on 1 year's salary, those 6 men could feed every writer in town. They could give every writer in town a decent living and a real career. And they could also support every retired writer in town with healthcare. That was not something that really existed in '07. But if you start looking at the one of the things is if they try to make a financial argument against us, the obscenity of the way with which they have handled their money compared to the way they have handled their talent, the people who actually make the products they profit from, is now something that can be very readily understood through social media, for example. So if they want to make an argument that we're losing money, we should end the strike, we'll gladly make the argument that if they forego compensation for 1 year, and they'll still make a $50 million bonus.
And to your point, Bill, about social media being a big difference, when I've spoken to some other writers who were around in 2007, and what they've told me is that they felt like the Writers Guild, like the leadership, has done a much better job communicating to its members and to the public exactly what is at stake. That he said that what one person told me was, I feel like in 2007 there was this general frustration with what was going on, need a change of status quo, but so many people, he said he felt so many people this time know much more specifically what the situation is and how it needs to be resolved. Do you feel like it's that same way that this is a much more educated membership from the way the Guild is communicated to it?
I mean, I think the biggest difference is that many more people, in fact, most people, have experienced the issues, the injustices that are the issues. It isn't just about educating people. It's about pointing out what's been happening to them and saying that that's not okay. And most of the time, members are saying, "Oh, I know. I experienced this." It's not really like they have to be brought over to a place of enlightenment. It's simply, bringing them over to a place to believe that a collective action at this point is the only chance we have. I think everyone up to this point has had their own agent or manager or lawyer trying to get them the things that they need or want, and have been, to a great extent unsuccessful. And so it's simply saying, if we band together, that is the chance that we have. And it's very disheartening, when you talk about these top executives and how much money they're making. Obviously, they have somehow convinced their shareholders or whomever is above them that is their value. And that's really all we're doing right now, is banding together to demand that our value is fairly compensated. And, I think that's really what we're telling each other, is that, if we stick together, that, hopefully we will be successful, but it's certainly the only chance we have to given the respect that we deserve.
I also don't remember before the Writers Guild sending out a chart with all the demands and all the responses from AMPTP, which was so enlightening. So I think they're doing
I agree.
It's very powerful to just see it right there, side by side, what we asked for and what they offered or didn't even respond to. And most of them, the majority of them, they have no response, and they don't want to talk about it. And it's a more complex set of demands than there have ever been before, because of the way the industry has been restructured with streaming, which is why I think it's going to be a longer strike. But you're right. I mean, the way to do that, I was in 2007, I was in a phone bank where people would call and go, "Where do I go?" Well, now it's a text. I'm doing it this afternoon. It's a text thing where we're texting. They have everybody's name in the Guild. And if someone hasn't scanned your card when you come into strike, and if you haven't showed a strike, it's like, "Hey, we're striking this week. Where do you plan to strike?" It's very efficient. The technology has impacted this in ways that we've never seen before. But I think you're right, Marta. I think the communication is sterling this year.
There's also one thing that people may not know about, but the Guild had a dress rehearsal for this about 4 years ago. we had an agency campaign because the agencies were making more money off of packaging, and the agencies were basically in the process of becoming corporations that made entertainment as opposed to places that represented artists and fought for the artists. So the Guild basically decided to fire all the agents at once, and we all did. And that campaign lasted 2 years, but over the course of 2 years, every single agency in Hollywood capitulated. And a lot of people in the Writers Guild came together, and it was sort of a teaching moment about solidarity. And I think we have that also now in our bones. This generation that's striking has already seen a labor action from the Guild win, and that's huge.
And actually, I just wrote a story about how the writers and the studios are preparing for this. It's on rapro.com right now. Check it out. Subscribe, please. Thank you. We appreciate it, viewers. But one thing that a consultant mentioned to me was that with that agency situation, that the WGA, they first talked with boutique firms and then slowly worked their way up. But you're talking on an individual basis with all the agencies to phase out packaging fees. Do you guys think that is something that might happen later on down the line, as we get closer to fall TV season, that there's a split between the streamers and the legacy studios that WGA might be able to exploit? Or I see you shaking your head. What do you think?
The difference, well, I just think that the big difference is the AMPTP houses the streamers, the studios, the networks. The agents didn't have that. They didn't have one overall united organization. So I think that's a big difference. Do I think there might be some back channeling and talking and maybe you can convince them kind of stuff? Yeah, I'm sure. Even trying to convince people to break from the AMPTP, I'm sure is happening. But I would be very surprised if they did.
Well, I think I'm piggybacking on what Marta just said. I think they learned a lot. The AMPTP learned a lot from that agency situation, that there were splinter groups. And I think they saw what happened, that the entire group capitulated to the Writers Guild. And I think that's incentive for them not to do it this time. But inherent in the legacy versus the streaming and their separate needs, I can't see how that tension isn't going to play out somehow.
I was going to say, this is the country that elected Donald Trump president, which to me means reality is broken and anything can happen. The bad side of that is anything can happen, but there's a good side. Anything can happen. So it's up to us to kind of guide the stream of energy toward what we want rather than toward other people want.
Yeah, and there is a huge opportunity here for someone, one of those very well-paid men, and it is all men, to break from the pack, and it's just a question of whether that opportunity can become more attractive to them than the opportunity of breaking the system of writers and removing writers. When Netflix first came along, and Marta, you could probably speak to this well, but when Netflix first came along, it came with the lure of artistic freedom for writers. They were coming with something new and different that really did value writers. And it's turned into something else to some extent. But there's a huge opportunity, whether it's for Ted Sarantos or Jeff Bezos or whoever's going to do it. There's a huge, huge opportunity. And it's just a question of if that becomes more attractive and valuable than breaking the system and breaking talent and turning to AI.
Let me just say, in terms of Netflix and when we did our show, yes, it was much more supportive of the artist. However, they wanted to be executive producers on everything that was made for Netflix. I said no, I wouldn't do it. I said absolutely not. There are too many producers, and the showrunners don't get a specific title, and everybody's mushed together. But even then, they were trying to encroach on the writer's place.
Interesting.
I think that there, look, when you talk about talking to these to management, okay, we can make all the emotional arguments. and we have, and they are really good arguments. We can make all the practical arguments, and we have, and they're very good arguments. There's one argument that I'd like to make, which is this. Over the 70s, 80s, 90s, and aughts, American television had a global hegemony, okay? CSI Miami was the most watched show in the world. Everybody can quote Chandler Bing from Friends, okay? Yes, I'm being very solicitous, but with good reason. Look, if you're a capitalist, having a system of writers that creates writer leaders, writer creators, that educates writers over a period of 30 years, the way that writing did in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and aughts, right? That is going to make you more money. That is your key to global domination. It is not to take the people who research and develop your projects and pay them less. Start looking at the writers as your R&D department, and start looking at your business as capitalistic, okay? And look at history. We still do this very well, and we still can do it better than anybody because there are people like us still around who learned under the old system. When this is done, if the studios win and television goes the way it's going, not only is the medium going to be very devalued, but all of those artistic gains that we made that led us to that golden age of television are going to be gone, and you will lose your hold on the world.
Now, let's just finish with this last question. So there's been so much engagement from all members of the WGA along with other guilds on the line here. There's, as you guys said, for younger writers, they know what is at stake because they have personally experienced it. But I just want to ask you guys, I don't know if there have been any younger writers who weren't in WGA back in 2007 that have asked you this, but what advice would you give them as this strike goes from being weeks long to months long?
I think I personally, more than giving them advice, would want them to know we are here for them and will support them and do everything we can to make sure that their jobs will be secure and that they will be appreciated.
I would say they have a golden opportunity right now walking these lines to meet people who can help them, who can teach them, who can mentor them. That's a great incentive to get out on the line and walk as many different lots as you can. I mean, I've met people, in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I've got their numbers, I've got their emails. They'll talk to me. Let's have lunch. Let's have coffee. It's a great opportunity for them to make themselves known.
And it will be over one way or another. It will end, and there will be a life after this. And we are living in exciting times because we don't know which way it's going to go. But I think everyone is waiting on tenterhooks to hear what is happening in the negotiations with the directors. That's the next piece of information that's going to come out. And then what happens in the negotiations with the actors? And do they make a deal, or are the actors going on strike too? I mean, I don't believe we will be back at the table with the AMPTP until after the June 30th deadline on those two agreements. So it is sort of, setting ourselves in, for the long haul, but it will be interesting to see what happens. And, yes, of course, I'm, enough of a worst case scenario person to know that it could all go to shit. But we have a chance here. And as I said, if our agents and lawyers and managers have been unable to get these things for us on an individual basis, this is the only chance we have. And we got to take it for all that it's worth.
Well, Stacy, Marta, Javi, Bill, thank you all so much for taking the time to talk with us about your memories of 2007, about what the WGA is facing here in the present and the future. We really appreciate all of you joining us here at The Wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
for having us.